one, as an African continent, but more so to understand that Africa's challenges are Africa's opportunities. So the challenges that you find in your communities, in your societies, that is where groundbreaking innovations to change our societies is going to come from. In this very forum, ladies and gentlemen, we're reminded of the words of Thomas Sankara, who said, "We must dare to imagine the future." The African Continental Free Trade Area gives us an opportunity to imagine this future. A future of Africa that invests in the total liberation of its people by fighting the scourge of poverty, violence, inequality, hunger, and unemployment. An Africa that values partnership and cooperation to the benefit of all. The time is at hand, ladies and gentlemen, for us to build a resilient continent that is anchored on production-intensive sectors, and we're able to ensure that trade becomes accessible to young people. A time for us to invest in structural reforms that allows the most marginalized to find space in their produce in different markets. It should not be unimaginable that a young person who comes from Limpopo, being a tomato farmer, can take and export their tomatoes to Ghana. That should not be unimaginable. It should be a future and a present we desire to have. A continent that invests in its own industrialization, as well as hold each other accountable and imbues a spirit of servanthood in its leaders. We must appreciate those that lead us at every proximal angle, but also to remind them that their service is not a favor to humanity. A leadership that puts the interests of Africa and its people first. We give this background, Deputy Minister, because as the NYDA, we believe that Africa plays a critical role in the growth and development of BRICS as a multilateral corporation. If Africa as a continent struggles, the participation of South Africa on BRICS will also struggle. So it is important for an Africa that moves as one, so we understand that Africa has got a direct investment and role to play in the success of BRICS as a multilateral corporation. It is intrinsically linked, and we need to be able to ensure that in all the spaces that we're in, as we move as one in the continent. We want to say there is fertile ground, ladies and gentlemen, for young people to participate in intra-Africa trade. What South Africa lacks in cocoa, there is definitely a country in Africa that can definitely make up for it. As I near to my closing remarks, the Minister of Women, Youth and Persons with Disability, Honorable Dr. Nkosazana, always says and challenges us that we are more interested in exporting employment. And when she unpacks this, she says, when you export raw materials, you're exporting employment because the beneficiation and the value chain does not stay in South Africa or the continent, but rather jobs are created in other countries where you export your raw materials. So it is important for us as a continent, as a country, to ensure that we participate in the value chain of all raw materials in the country.
With regard to trade and the future economic trajectory of our continent and BRICS in general. But as an economic geographer, who is interested in geopolitical positioning, I struggle to imagine the South African economy outside of the African continent as a whole. I do this in order to disrupt what I call the epistemological and ontological foundations of coloniality. In other words, the South African economy is a colonial output of the division of the continent. So I refuse to do that and to talk about Africa in relation to BRICS and the rest of the world. That's the point, the first point that I wish to stress, which I think is important. But also the power to defend our territorial integrity and national sovereignty, but in particular our ability to write our own terms and conditions of development, is inextricably linked to us looking in the mirror and liking what we see. The ability of this continent to be a meaningful participant in geopolitical developments is inherently linked to us fighting 3,000 years of siege. For 3,000 years and more, we've been under siege as a continent. We've been under siege because we had and still have that which the rest of the world needs, that which they can't do without, and most importantly, that which they are not prepared to pay a proper price for. So in entertaining trade analysis and economic analysis, we have to take the position that we are that which everyone else needs, and therefore our position of strength emerges from that. Why am I saying this? I don't have enough time to justify that statement, but safe to say that 2023 marks the 75th anniversary of the post-World War II economic order that hasn't been particularly kind to the future economic prospects of this continent and, of course, this country. This country, I need not explain, is the most unequal one in the world, which means the neoliberal experiment has failed, which means as we talk about trade and economic analysis, our attempt to undo decades of plundering and exploitation that predate apartheid, which was slightly a more sophisticated version of coloniality, we must be prepared to write our own script. All right. Now, having said that, I want to stress that terms and words matter. So when we talk about free trade or free markets, Ha-Joon Chang, the South Korean economist, cautions us to say, in the past, the dominant groups expressed belief in free markets or free trade should not be conflated with actual adherence to free trade. In fact, the version of free trade doctrine as enforced by the currently dominant order has been a case of do as I say and not as I do. All right. Second last point that I wish to stress before I conclude, given the limitation of time for such an important topic, is that I want to recommend the book Kicking Away the Ladder. Because Kicking Away the Ladder gives you a script of how those who reached economic might by protecting infant industries today preach against that particular method, hence kicking away the ladder. It means you climb the top of the roof and then you kick the ladder with which you climb so that everyone else can walk up the mountain. All right. But also, if we're talking about free trade, we must ask the questions, are we free? What is the content and form of that freedom? Until we have full control over the wealth-producing resources of our land, we cannot possibly be free. Which begs the question then, what is the role of unfree people in free trade? My answer is very straightforward. There is no free trade by unfree people. So, the point number one in meaningfully engaging in free trade is wrestling the control over the wealth-producing resources of our land and then writing the terms and conditions with which anyone else wants to interact with us. That is my proposition, at least. Now, we ought to put our foot down because President Nkrumah warned about something called sham independence or client states. And President Nkrumah said in his handbook for revolutionary warfare said, client states or sham independent states are states that are independent de jure and dependent de facto, independent on paper, dependent in reality. Now, that statement remains relevant today. If you are to judge us by how far we have come, he added, you ought to understand the depth from which we emerged. And in the context of South Africa, and as I said in the beginning, Africa, my head struggles to imagine this thing or this construction called South Africa. So within the context of the African continent, President Nkrumah was cautioning us to say no zinc, no gold, no manganese must live without being beneficiated and industrialized here. We must trade in finished goods because our ability to trade in finished goods is linked to security independence, economic independence, and the ability to preserve our way of life. So, in conclusion, I'm a teacher there by the University of Georgia.
Are constituting 24% of the global GDP and 16% of the global trade, which have got 41% of the total global population. That is both in terms of the labor market and in terms of the global market. So, for South Africa to be merely a member of the BRICS bloc assists nothing for Africa. It is nothing for Africa. And it is nothing for young South Africans who are supposed to be looking at all these opportunities that were displayed by Inter-Africa Trade Fair here. They will mean nothing because the biggest barrier for participation of young people into global capital accumulation is access to finance and logistics, poor logistics development in the African continent to be able to trade. So unless we utilize the new development bank, because my argument says, if you understand the global the making of global capitalism, you would know that there's nothing called World Bank. It's not a World Bank, it's an American bank.
Correct.
You see, you would know that the IMF is an American bank.
Yeah.
And the terms within which it was formulated have been shifted for the developing countries of the world. Because when they wanted to give some intra-development or intra-trade for Europe, for the Marshall Plan, the terms were so soft for the Marshall Plan. But for the developing countries in Africa and in the Latin America and in the Asian Pacific, the terms shifted. So the World Bank is not the World Bank, it's an American bank to keep control of the global trade. And if BRICS has to be anything, China, if BRICS has to be anything, China, India, and Russia must assist Africa. Must assist Africa. They must not also want to flood the African continent with finished goods. So that we can be able to do our own import replacement industrialization in the continent and create the much needed jobs, and will not be talking about unemployment, inequalities and poverty in Africa. If China, Brazil and Russia are meaning what we are saying, that we're shifting the paradigm of global trade balances. So we are putting indictment into our own partners in the BRICS bloc that they must not also use the imperialist instruments to want to flood the continent with their own finished products. So which is my departing point is Puti Manamela, that we are here in this multilateral engagement as part of restructuring and transforming global governance. You know, because if we can't say these things that I'm raising now, global governance and imbalance, how global economy is evenly articulated, and how wealth and income in the world is evenly articulated, will be maintained for the next 100 years unless we change these fundamentals. Thank you very much. To depart on, but I'll just make a few points around energy. And I think these are what I refer to as game changers for the African continent. You know, the energy infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and the finance infrastructure. Sure. In the continent. And these are three interrelated aspects that we need to quite succinctly resolve very quickly as the continent. And I'm saying this because one thing we have raised is that there is nothing called free trade.
Yes.
There is no such thing called free trade. Mm-hmm. In free trade, correctly as Doc was saying, do as we tell you, not as we do. Mm-hmm. In the energy debate currently. It's an international debate. It's no longer a national discourse. It's an international debate on energy. The issue is what constitutes a baseload of a particular country or continent for energy. In the current context in South Africa, it is coal, Putimanamel. It is coal. It doesn't mean fossil fuel should always be our baseload. But what maintains the baseload in the continent now, in South Africa now, and which is our comparative advantage on the basis of the endowment that we have, is coal. But Europeans and Americans are telling everyone, decarbonize. But they are not decarbonizing in Europe. They are not decarbonizing. In China, which is a factory of the world, they have not decarbonized because they understand that they need to maintain the base load for their industries. But they are telling you that you must advance quickly for just transition. Do as we tell you, not as we do. That's the free trade that they are telling us.
Thank you.
So Hashum Sheng is correct. They are kicking the ladder.
Yes.
So that Africa does not grow.
Yes.
So that industrialization here is a myth. Yes. Only what Karl Marx says,